Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there's a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video. Today, we're continuing on in our whole entire series about Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. And today we're in chapter 8, where Paul is addressing one of those hard to deal with concepts where God uses our conscience or our inner voice or that place inside of our minds where we process thought to guide us and to judge us. For instance, for those of you who have been a part of this series so far, you know that Paul is in part responding to a letter that he received from the church in Corinth where they were asking a variety of questions. And one of the questions that had come up was when it came to dietary instructions, not so much about, hey, what to eat if I want to gain or what to not eat if I want to lose weight, but more about when and when not to eat certain things because of people who have weak consciences. For instance, look at what it is that he said about this. 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 7. Now, regarding your question about food that has been offered to idols, yes, we know that we all have knowledge about this issue. But while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church. Anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know very much. But the person who loves God is the one whom God recognizes. So, what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Well, we all know that an idol is not really a god and that there is only one God. There may be so-called gods both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. But for us, there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we live. However, not all believers know this. Some are accustomed to thinking of idols as being real. So when they eat food that has been offered to idols, they think of it as the worship of real gods, and their weak consciences are violated. Within the context of this passage, what kind of person did Paul say has a weak conscience? And if we have a friend with a weak conscience, what should we do? According to Paul, when a believer in that culture still had some sort of a concept of these false gods as being real, that their conscience, therefore, was weak and immature, that they didn't understand through maturity that there was only one true God. And so what Paul instructed those who were strong and mature to do was, rather than immediately just trying to change those people's minds and just pursue their dietary freedoms, he asked them to be conscientious and sensitive of those who had weak consciences and to kind of play along with that idea rather than trying to confuse them or push them too fast. In fact, when Paul wrote to the church in Rome, this same type of problem was happening because, again, Corinth, Rome, they're very similar. And you have a lot of people who were Jews who, honestly, they didn't have anything to do with certain types of meats. And then you have a group of people who were Gentiles coming into the church, and they had no problem with any of that. They got this crash that's taking place. And so what Paul was trying to say is, hey, all of you who are mature, for those of you who are now looking at immature believers who have weak consciences, pay attention and be careful of them. Again, here's what he wrote to the church in Rome. Romans 14, 14 and 21 through 23. I know and am convinced on the authority of the Lord Jesus that no food, in and of itself, is wrong to eat. But if someone believes it is wrong, then for that person it is wrong. It is better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else if it might cause another believer to stumble. You may believe there's nothing wrong with what you are doing, but keep it between yourself and God. Blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something they have decided is right. But if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it. For you are not following your convictions. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning. Pretend a Christian from a foreign country is visiting your home, but they don't drink wine or eat meat of any kind because in their conscience they believe it's wrong. What should you do? And the best-rated restaurant in town is owned by a moon worshiper. Would you eat there? Why or why not? Let me get personal for a second. I grew up in a home where my mom and dad, not because of a weak conscience, but because they had a particular choice that they made that drinking alcohol of any kind would be a violation of something they felt was a sin that they shouldn't do. Therefore, they stayed away from it. However, they knew that alcohol wasn't prohibited in the Bible. They just personally chose that path because they had the freedom to be able to do so. And in their spiritual maturity, they recognized that drinking of any kind might cause problems for a lot of other people, and they had seen that in their own lives. However, they gave me and my siblings the freedom to be able to make those choices for ourselves. And as I grew older, I chose to start drinking alcohol and enjoyed certain types of alcohol. And in my immaturity, I did the exact thing that Paul said not to do, which is I attempted to try to change my mom and dad's view on alcohol to match mine. In fact, most attempts to change someone's personal dietary convictions to match our own are based in pride. And I was certainly operating out of pride. And so, again, what Paul was saying is if a person is spiritually mature, like I thought I was, what we are actually supposed to do is be sensitive to those regardless of what their opinions are about these types of things. But specifically in that culture, as Paul was alluding to, there are people who believed that, well, these gods are real. And so as a result, they believed that any type of participation in anything associated with those gods was an act of worship, and therefore their consciences were violated. And what Paul was saying to those who were truly spiritually mature is no. What we have to do is put dietary restrictions on ourselves for the benefit of others, and we would restrict our freedoms. In fact, here's what Paul went on to write next. 1 Corinthians 8 through 13. It's true that we can't win God's approval by what we eat. We don't lose anything if we don't eat it, and we don't gain anything if we do. But you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. For if others see you with your superior knowledge eating in the temple of an idol, won't they be encouraged to violate their conscience by eating food that has been offered to an idol? So because of your superior knowledge, a weak believer for whom Christ died will be destroyed. And when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something they believe is wrong, you are sinning against Christ. So if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live, for I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. Read Matthew 18, 6 through 9. If we make other believers violate their conscience or stumble to the point where they're destroyed, Paul said that's a sin against Christ. What do you think the consequences would be for something like this? In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, we see Paul's true attitude when it comes to dietary instructions for the people. Meaning, instead of making some sort of an awareness campaign or increasing awareness for all of his audience on the benefits of eating meat or how drinking wine can reduce the stress levels in your life, what Paul decided to do was instead insist that those who were spiritually mature like him, that what they would do is that they would hide from the view of those who had weak consciences anything that they might particularly enjoy, all for the sake of making sure that nobody would be stumbling when it came to moving forward in their relationship with Christ. Or in other words, this thing that Paul wanted for everybody in the church at Corinth to understand that was true maturity is that you and I who are mature should be helping those who are immature find the simplest path to following Jesus without putting any kind of stumbling block in their way that might confuse them. This is hard to do, especially when you're a person who has gained knowledge like what the Corinthians thought they had. And because this is so important, it's what I'm going to be talking about on Sunday, and I hope you can join me.